There are stories in the annals of music that test our understanding of fame, of art, and of rebellion. And then there is a story that sets fire to the rulebook, urinates on the ashes, and forces us to question the very limits of human behavior. This is not a story for the faint of heart. It is a journey into an abyss, a case study in self-destruction so absolute, so committed, that it remains one of the most disturbing and transgressive tales in modern cultural history. We are going to talk about a man who was a rock and roll performer, but his concerts rarely featured much music. They were rituals of chaos and violence. He would appear on stage only to immediately attack his audience. He would slice his own body open with broken bottles and microphone stands. And in his most infamous act, he would regularly defecate on stage, smearing his own feces on his body and flinging it at the people who had paid to see him. His name was Jesus Allin, and it's easy, perhaps even comforting, to dismiss him as a disgusting monster, a depraved lunatic, a footnote of filth best left forgotten. But the truth is infinitely more complex and far more tragic. The man who committed these unspeakable acts was born with the name Jesus Christ. He was a product of one of the most horrific childhoods imaginable, and for a brief shining moment, he was a talented musician who wrote catchy melodic pop-punk songs. The story of how that boy became this monster is a terrifying odyssey into the darkest corners of the human psyche. It's a story that blurs the lines between performance art and profound mental illness, between rebellion and pathology. To understand Jesus Allin is not to condone him. It is to force ourselves to look at the wreckage of a human life and ask the terrible question, why? To find the source code for the chaos that was Jesus Allin, you can't start in the punk clubs of New York or Boston. You have to travel to the deep, silent woods of northern New Hampshire, to a time before the counterculture, before the social revolutions of the 1960s. It was a place of rugged, isolating beauty, but also of crushing rural poverty and a fierce, often brutal self-reliance. It was a world away from America that was starting to appear on television screens. It was here, in a primitive log cabin in the town of Lancaster in 1956, that a boy was born. His father, Merle Allin Sr., was a reclusive, antisocial, and profoundly disturbed man. He was a religious fanatic, though his beliefs were a twisted personal concoction of Old Testament fire and brimstone. He believed that he was a modern-day prophet in direct communication with God. And when his second son was born, Merle Sr. claimed that an angel had appeared to him and told him that this child would be a great man in the image of the Savior, a new Messiah. And so he gave the infant a name that was both a divine prophecy and a crushing, lifelong burden: Jesus Christ Allin. Life inside that log cabin was a gothic horror story. There was no electricity, no running water. The world was lit by kerosene lamps, and warmth came from a wood stove. Merle Sr. ruled his wife Arleta and his two young sons with a fist of absolute, terror-inducing control. He was a violent, abusive man who forbade any conversation in the cabin after dark. Silence was the law, enforced by the ever-present threat of his shotgun. He was obsessed with death and the afterlife, and at one point, in a fit of messianic delusion, he began digging what he claimed would be the family's graves into the dirt floor of the cabin's cellar, telling them they might all have to die to be purified. This was the environment that shaped the boy who would become Jesus Allin. It was a childhood devoid of safety, affection, and normal human interaction. His only companion was his older brother, also named Merle, who, unable to pronounce Jesus properly, would call him JJ. The nickname stuck, eventually morphing into GG. It was a seemingly innocent name born from a world of profound trauma. Gigi's understanding of family was based on fear. His understanding of authority was based on violent tyranny, and his understanding of God was based on the ravings of a madman. When Gigi was still a toddler, his mother, Arletta, finally summoned the courage to escape her tormentor. She took her 2 sons and fled, divorcing Merle Sr. and eventually moving to a small town in Vermont. For Gigi and Merle, it was like landing on another planet. They were thrust into the world of public schools, but they were utterly unprepared. They were socially awkward, academically far behind, and carried with them the strange feral energy of children raised in extreme isolation. They were immediately branded as outsiders, the weird boys from the woods. Gigi in particular struggled. He was placed in special education classes, was held back a grade, and was a frequent target for bullies, which led to him becoming a bully himself. His early life had taught him that the world was a hostile place, and his only response was aggression. It was a pattern that would come to define his entire existence. As a deeply alienated teenager, Gigi Allin discovered the 2 things that would offer him a potential path out of the darkness: rock and roll and drag. He was fascinated by the glam rock theatrics of bands like the New York Dolls, and he and his brother Merle began to form their own garage bands. And this is where we encounter the most jarring and surreal chapter of the Gigi Allin story, the part that is almost always overlooked. His early music was not the ugly, discordant noise he would later become infamous for. In fact, for a time, he was a talented and charismatic power pop musician. In the late 1970s, he and Merle formed a band called the Jabbers. Gigi was the drummer and increasingly the lead singer. They played a style of music that was a perfect blend of 1960s bubblegum pop, glam rock swagger, and early punk rock energy. Their songs were short, fast, and incredibly catchy. Tracks like Sherry Love Affair and 1880s Rock and Roll were filled with hooks and melodic choruses. Lyrically, they were transgressive and juvenile, with songs about sex and rebellion, but musically, they were tight and well-crafted. Gigi at this time was a dynamic frontman. He was handsome, with a cocky Iggy Pop-style swagger. He was a far cry from the bloated, scarred monster he would later become. The Jabbers became a popular act on the small New Hampshire and Vermont punk scene. They had a devoted local following. Listening to these early recordings today is a profoundly strange experience. You can hear the ghost of a completely different future. In another timeline, it's easy to imagine Gigi Allin becoming a cult hero of the power pop underground, a figure like Steve Bators of the Dead Boys, known for his wild antics, but also for his genuinely great rock and roll songs. He was ambitious, articulate, and knew how to write a hook. He had the talent to make it. But the wider success he craved never came. The Jabbers were too punk for the pop crowd, and too pop for the hardcore punk scene. Gigi grew increasingly frustrated. He felt that the world had rejected his attempt to play by its rules, however bent those rules were. The darkness that had been planted in him during his childhood, the rage and the nihilism, began to fester. He started drinking more heavily. His onstage antics became less about showmanship and more about genuine aggression. He began to believe that his failure was proof that the entire system was corrupt. He felt that rock and roll and the punk scene itself had become a joke, a safe, commercialized pantomime of rebellion. And so, he made a conscious decision. If the world would not accept him as a rock and roll star, he would become its antichrist. He would become a mirror, reflecting all of the world's sickness and hypocrisy back at itself. He would make rock and roll dangerous again. He would destroy it, and he would start by destroying the talented, charismatic musician, known as Jesus Allin. The period from about 1984 onwards marks Gigi's great transformation. It was a deliberate, systematic shedding of every last vestige of conventional musicianship and human decency. He dissolved the jabbers and began a nomadic existence, cycling through a series of backing bands with names that reflected his new philosophy: the Scumfucks, the Cedar Street Sluts, the Holy Men. His music became a primitive, atonal dirge, a barely structured soundtrack for his increasingly unhinged performances. This is when the on-stage behavior escalated into the realm of legend. The self-mutilation began in earnest. He would smash beer bottles and gouge his own forehead and chest, smearing the blood across his face like war paint. He saw his body as the ultimate instrument and his blood as the ultimate truth. He started fighting his audiences, not as a theatrical gesture, but with the genuine intent to do harm. He saw the crowd not as fans to be entertained, but as representatives of the sick society he despised, and he declared war on them every single night. And then came the act that would forever seal his infamy. He began defecating on stage. The first time it happened, it was reportedly an accident, the result of him being drunk and having taken laxatives. But when he saw the absolute horror and shock on the faces of the audience, he realized he had found his ultimate weapon. It was the one taboo that no one, not even the most extreme punk rockers, had dared to cross. From that point on, it became a regular part of his act. He would ingest massive amounts of laxatives before a show, and during the performance he would squat on stage and relieve himself, often grabbing the feces and flinging it into the crowd or eating it. To the outside world, this was the act of a depraved madman. But in Gigi's own twisted logic, it was a profound philosophical statement. He was, in his mind, reintroducing the animal to the human. He was showing the audience their own true nature, stripped of all social conditioning. He famously said, "My mind is a machine gun, my body is the bullets, the audience is the target." He was forcing people to confront the raw, ugly, biological reality of existence. It was a baptism of filth, and it made him the most notorious and reviled performer in America. Naturally, his career became a chaotic cycle of short, violent shows followed by immediate arrests. He was banned from city after city. Venue owners who were foolish enough to book him would often find their clubs completely destroyed. He was in and out of jail, mostly on assault charges. But the more he was arrested, the more his legend grew in the underground. He was a real-life outlaw, a genuine threat to public order in a way that no musician had been before. His brother Merle, ever loyal, would often follow him around, bailing him out of jail and trying to book the next disastrous gig. Theirs was one of the strangest partnerships in music history. The quiet, methodical bass player and his brother, the out-of-control human car crash. In 1989, Jesus Allin was arrested in Ann Arbor, Michigan, and charged with the assault of a female acquaintance. He was convicted and sentenced to 1.5 years in prison. This period of forced sobriety and confinement had a profound effect on him. It didn't reform him, it crystallized his ideology. He spent his time in prison writing his manifesto, a series of unhinged but sometimes surprisingly articulate essays outlining his worldview. He began referring to himself as the public animal, a new messiah for a new sick age. He declared that rock and roll was dead and he was its killer. He believed the entire system, from the major labels to the underground punk scene, was a lie. His mission, as he saw it, was to bring it all crashing down. He wrote, "I am the last of the originals, the true rock and roller, who lives and dies for what he believes in, to take rock and roll to the grave where it belongs." It was during this time in prison that he made his most infamous and chilling promise. He declared that he would, at the absolute peak of his notoriety, commit suicide on stage during a show on Halloween night. He didn't just plan to kill himself, he vowed to take members of his audience with him to create a final, spectacular act of murder-suicide that would forever cement his legend and expose the ultimate sickness of the world. It was a threat that transformed him from a mere shock rocker into a genuine domestic terrorist in the eyes of the law. He was no longer just a disgusting performer, he was a potential mass murderer. When he was released from prison in 1991, his legend had grown exponentially. He was now the subject of a documentary, Hated Jesus Allin and the Murder Junkies, being filmed by a young NYU student named Todd Phillips. Phillips, who would decades later achieve massive fame as the director of films like The Hangover and Joker, captured the final chaotic years of Gigi's life with an unflinching, fly-on-the-wall intimacy. The film brought Gigi's horrifying world to a much wider audience and sparked a fierce debate that continues to this day. Was Jesus Allin a legitimate artist, or was he just a sick man being exploited? The art argument points to a long tradition of transgressive performance, from the Dadaists of the early 20th century to the Vienna actionists of the 1960s, who also used self-harm and bodily fluids to shock the bourgeoisie. In this light, Gigi can be seen as the ultimate folk artist, a primitive shaman using his own body as a canvas to critique a corrupt society. He was perhaps the most honest performer who ever lived, a man who refused to create any separation between his life and his art. The counter-argument, however, is far more compelling to many. It posits that Jesus Allin was a deeply, profoundly mentally ill individual, a man suffering from a cocktail of personality disorders, post-traumatic stress, and substance-induced psychosis, all stemming from his horrific childhood. In this view, his performances were not calculated art, but the uncontrolled outpourings of a man in immense unrelenting pain. He was a victim, not a visionary, and the people who put him on stage, who wrote about him in magazines, and who filmed him for documentaries were not patrons of the arts. They were exploiters, profiting from the public destruction of a man who was clearly and desperately in need of psychiatric help. By the summer of 1993, Jesus Allin was a ghost. At 36, he looked decades older. Years of heavy drinking, drug abuse, and a diet that consisted mostly of cheap beer, and whatever he could steal had left him gaunt and frail. His body was a roadmap of scars from his nightly self-mutilations. The man who had promised a spectacular suicide seemed far more likely to simply collapse from malnutrition and exhaustion. He had formed his final and most notorious backing band, the Murder Junkies, featuring his brother Merle on bass and a wild, often naked drummer named Dino Sex. They embarked on one last chaotic tour. On the night of June 27, 1993, the tour shambled into New York City for a show at a tiny illegal punk venue in the East Village called The Gas Station. The club was a cramped, filthy space, packed well beyond its capacity, with a mix of curious onlookers, die-hard fans, and undercover police. The show was a disaster from the moment it began. The sound system repeatedly failed. After just a couple of songs, an enraged Gigi smashed a microphone, cut the power to the club, and the entire event descended into a full-blown riot. What happened next is the final iconic image of his life. Gigi, nearly naked, covered in a mixture of mud, his own blood, and feces, emerged from the club and began a long, stumbling march through the late-night streets of Manhattan's East Village. He was a terrifying apparition, a real-life monster escaped from the id, lurching through the city like a wounded animal. He was followed by a strange procession of his fans, a chaotic parade of the damned. He was the Pied Piper of filth, leading his followers on one last journey into the night. Eventually, he and his entourage ended up at a party in the apartment of a fan. Gigi, the ferocious center of the storm just an hour earlier, was now completely spent. He found a spot on the floor, took a large amount of heroin, and passed out. To the other partygoers, this was just Gigi being Gigi. They were so desensitized to his extreme behavior that they saw nothing amiss. For hours, they continued to party around his motionless body. In a final grotesque act of fandom, some of them posed for photographs with him. They put a beer bottle in his hand. They draped their arms around him, smiling for the camera, capturing a souvenir of their night with the legendary Jesus Allin. But he wasn't passed out. He wasn't asleep. He was dying. No one at the party, not his fans, not his friends, realized that he had overdosed until the next morning, when they found him cold and blue. Jesus Allin, the man who had promised to go out in a blaze of suicidal, murderous glory, had died a quiet, pathetic, and deeply lonely death on a stranger's dirty floor. His final audience had simply watched and laughed as he slipped away. What is the legacy of Jesus Allin? It's a question that has no easy answer. Musically, he left almost no trace. His songs are rarely covered. His albums are mostly unlistenable exercises in low-fidelity noise. His influence is not musical. It is cultural. He is a ghost, a bogeyman, a cautionary tale that haunts the very idea of rebellion. He represents the absolute final station on the line of rock and roll defiance. He took the nihilistic, no-future promise of punk rock and followed it to its most logical, terrifying conclusion. He showed what happens when the performance completely devours the performer, when the mask becomes the face. In his own twisted way, he achieved his goal. He destroyed rock and roll, at least for himself, by exposing the performative nature of its rebellion and replacing it with something horrifically real. His story also holds up a dark mirror to our culture. It forces us to ask deeply uncomfortable questions about what we consume as entertainment and the lines between documenting a subject and exploiting them. His fame, such as it was built on our own morbid curiosity, our own fascination with the grotesque. He was in a car crash that we couldn't look away from, and his life and death challenge us to examine the ethics of our own gaze. In the end, there is no simple way to categorize the life of the man born Jesus Christ Allin. He was not a hero. He was not a role model. He was a profoundly damaged human being who weaponized his own trauma and turned his life into a spectacle of his own destruction. He was a product of a uniquely American cocktail of rural poverty, religious fanaticism, and a deep-seated rage against a world that had, from his very first moments, shown him nothing but cruelty. But to dismiss him as pure evil is to ignore the profound tragedy at the heart of his story. It is the story of a boy who was failed by everyone at every turn. He was failed by his abusive father, failed by a school system that couldn't handle him, and failed by an underground culture that chose to celebrate his sickness rather than try to heal it. And ultimately, he was failed by himself, unable to escape the prison of pain that had been built around him in that dark log cabin in the woods. The story of Jesus Allin is not one to be celebrated. It is one to be studied, to be mourned, and to be deeply, deeply feared. It is a lesson in what can happen when a human soul is filled with so much pain that its only form of expression is to scream and to keep screaming until there is nothing left but silence. That's a wrap for today's video. If you enjoyed it, smash that like button, drop us a comment below, and don't forget to subscribe so you'll never miss our new content. Thanks for watching.